Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you're part of our journey. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and get ready for a story that will leave you thinking. And if you love inspiring tales, a like goes a long way. She should have planned better. The words cut through the crowded terminal like glass. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she clutched her cane, her eyes fixed on the floor in shame. She traveled to see her first grandchild, not knowing the small souvenirs she'd collected would cost her so much. The weight of stares from annoyed travelers behind her only added to her burden. The airport gate area buzzed with the usual chaos of departures. Business travelers impatiently checking watches, families corralling children, announcements echoing through the terminal. But in this small space between the check-in counter and the boarding line, time seemed suspended. The airline representative's voice remained professionally cold, explaining company policy with practiced detachment. $60 for 3 pounds of excess baggage. No exceptions. Behind his baseball cap and sunglasses, he watched. Most passengers averted their eyes, headphones in, phones up, the universal shield against others' problems. Some sighed dramatically, checking the time. The woman's shoulders hunched further with each passing second, her dignity eroding under the weight of public shame. That's when Leonardo DiCaprio stepped forward, removing his sunglasses. If this moment made you feel something, imagine what's coming next. Hit that like button and stay with us. Subscribe now. Margaret Wilson had spent 43 years as a kindergarten teacher in Ohio. Now 76, with arthritis claiming more of her mobility each year, she'd saved for months to visit her daughter in Seattle. The birth of her first grandchild had pulled her across the country despite her fear of flying. Her small pension barely covered her living expenses, but she'd managed to scrape together enough for the ticket and a few small gifts: hand-knitted baby clothes, a children's book she'd read to her students for decades, and small handmade toys from her hometown's craft fair. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the policy is clear," the airline representative repeated, her name tag reading Jessica, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "The excess weight fee is $60. I can't let you board otherwise." Jessica's voice carried the practiced patience of someone who had this conversation daily. Her eyes darted to the growing line behind Margaret, her finger hovering over the keyboard, ready to move on to the next passenger. An announcement overhead called for final boarding of another flight, adding to the tension in the crowded terminal. "I don't understand. It's just a few pounds over," Margaret said, her voice barely audible over the terminal noise. Her weathered hands trembled as she opened her wallet, revealing a few carefully arranged bills, her emergency money for the week-long stay. "I've already paid for my ticket. It took months to save." The desperation in her eyes contrasted sharply with the collective indifference surrounding her. A businessman behind her checked his watch conspicuously, while a couple whispered to each other, glancing at Margaret with thinly veiled impatience. The line had grown longer, snaking through the terminal. Passengers shifted their weight from one foot to another, the collective irritation becoming palpable. "Look, we all have places to be," a voice called from the line. "Just pay it or step aside." Several nods of agreement followed. Jessica's expression remained unchanged, professional yet unyielding. "I understand it's frustrating, but I don't make the policies," she explained, glancing again at the growing line. "I need to know your decision, ma'am. Will you be paying the fee or removing items from your luggage?" Several rows back, Leonardo DiCaprio stood quietly observing. He'd arrived early for his flight, hoping to avoid recognition. The baseball cap pulled low, and designer sunglasses had worked until now, allowing him a rare moment of anonymity. He watched Margaret's shoulders slouch further with each passing moment, the weight of public humiliation heavier than any baggage. His mind flashed to his own grandmother, who'd supported his earliest acting ambitions with unwavering belief. The woman before him could have been her, dignified, proud, yet vulnerable. Margaret began opening her suitcase right there at the counter, hands shaking as she tried to decide which gifts for her new grandchild she would have to abandon. The handmade blanket she'd spent months knitting, the silver rattle that had been in her family for generations. Each item represented more than its weight. They were pieces of herself, her history, her love. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized no matter what she chose, something meaningful would be left behind. The collective sigh from those waiting pierced the air as she struggled with the zipper. Jessica's professional smile thinned with each passing second. Things are about to take a turn. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe, like our video, and keep watching. Leonardo moved without further hesitation, stepping out of line and approaching the counter. The crowd's attention shifted instantly, a wave of recognition rippling through the terminal. Whispers of, "Is that?" and "DiCaprio?" replaced the impatient sighs. Phones emerged from pockets, discreetly aimed in his direction. But Leo's focus remained solely on Margaret, who was still struggling with her luggage, unaware of the celebrity now standing beside her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice gentle, yet carrying the natural authority that had commanded movie sets for decades. Margaret looked up, confusion crossing her face as she registered the stranger addressing her. Jessica's professional demeanor faltered for the first time, her eyes widening in recognition. "I couldn't help overhearing," Leo continued. "There seems to be an issue with the baggage weight?" His question was directed at Jessica, but his eyes stayed compassionately on Margaret, who still hadn't realized who was speaking to her. It's 3 pounds over," Margaret explained, embarrassment coloring her voice. "I didn't know about the extra fees." She looked down at her partially opened suitcase where a small hand-knitted baby blanket in pale yellow was visible among her carefully packed belongings. "I'm going to meet my first grandchild. Emma was born 3 weeks ago." Leo's expression softened further as he noticed a framed photograph nestled among the clothes, clearly a new baby, wrapped in hospital blankets. "I'd be happy to take care of that fee," Leo said, reaching for his wallet. Jessica's professional composure transformed into starstruck awe, her earlier strictness melting away. "Actually, Mr. DiCaprio, I'm sure we could make an exception," she began, but Leo raised his hand gently to stop her. "No exceptions needed. The airline has its policies," he said firmly but kindly. "I'll just pay the fee." He handed over his credit card, maintaining eye contact with Margaret, who was gradually realizing the identity of her benefactor. Her eyes widened in recognition, a flush rising to her cheeks. Behind them, the terminal had gone oddly quiet, the usual airport chaos momentarily suspended as passengers watched the scene unfold. "I can't accept that," Margaret whispered, pride battling with necessity. "It's very kind. But I couldn't possibly—" Leo leaned closer, his voice for her ears alone. "My grandmother raised me while my parents worked. She took 3 buses to bring me to auditions when I was starting out. She'd never forgive me if I didn't help you get to your grandchild." The simple sincerity in his voice silenced any further protests. Jessica processed the payment, suddenly over-solicitous, her earlier impatience nowhere to be seen. Phones throughout the terminal captured the moment, though many lowered their devices as they recognized the private nature of the conversation. As Jessica finished processing the payment, she slid the boarding pass across the counter with a newly enthusiastic smile. "You're all set, Miss Wilson, and we've upgraded you to premium economy for your comfort." The very same airline policy that had been immovable moments ago now bent like a reed in the wind. Several passengers who had been the most vocal about their impatience suddenly found great interest in their phones, avoiding eye contact with each other in the scene before them. "Thank you," Margaret said, her voice steadier now as she looked directly at Leonardo. "Not just for this, but for how you did it." Her eyes, bright with unshed tears, held a wisdom that comes only with decades of watching human nature at its best and worst. Leo nodded, understanding what she meant, the dignity with which he'd offered help, without spectacle or condescension. The crowd's attention remained fixed on them, the moment crystallizing into something beyond a simple act of generosity. For many watching, the stark contrast between their own inaction and DiCaprio's simple intervention created an uncomfortable self-reflection. A man who had played historical figures who changed the world was showing that real heroism often comes in quiet moments of basic human decency. Some passengers looked away, suddenly conscious of their earlier irritation. Others watched openly, phones recording a moment that would soon spread across social media platforms with unstoppable momentum. This story is only getting deeper. What would you do in this situation? Comment below, and let's talk. As Leo helped Margaret close her suitcase, securing the gifts that would now make their journey to her grandchild, a slow ripple effect moved through the terminal. A businessman who had checked his watch repeatedly during Margaret's struggle stepped forward. "I'd like to buy Miss Wilson a meal voucher for her flight," he announced, avoiding Leo's eyes but addressing Margaret directly. The businessman handed his corporate card to Jessica, who blinked in surprise at this chain reaction of generosity. "And I work for the airline's partner hotel in Seattle," added a woman who had been quietly watching. "I'd be happy to arrange a complimentary airport pickup for you when you land." The atmosphere in the terminal had transformed completely. Where moments before had been impatience and indifference, there was now a community awakening to its better nature. Jessica's supervisor had appeared, drawn by the commotion and the celebrity presence, ready to smooth over any issues with professional damage control. "Mr. DiCaprio, we're so sorry for any inconvenience," the supervisor began, but Leo interrupted her gently. "There's been no inconvenience to me," he said, his voice carrying clearly to those watching. The only person inconvenienced was Ms. Wilson, who was being held to a policy without any flexibility or compassion. The supervisor's practiced smile faltered under his direct but calm observation. "Perhaps the issue isn't about baggage weight at all, but about how we treat each other when there's a power imbalance." The terminal fell silent again, his words resonating through the space. Margaret stood straighter now, her dignity restored not just by the practical solution to her problem, but by the acknowledgement of the fundamental unfairness she had experienced. Leo continued, his voice thoughtful rather than accusatory. "We've all been in positions where we needed someone to show a little grace, and we've all been in positions where we could offer that grace to someone else." Several people in line shifted uncomfortably, recognizing themselves in his gentle rebuke. The man who had called out for Margaret to pay or step aside stared fixedly at the floor. The couple who had whispered and rolled their eyes now looked at each other with mirrored expressions of shame. Jessica's professional mask had cracked completely, revealing a young woman who suddenly seemed to be reconsidering her approach to her job and perhaps much more. "Your company policy isn't wrong," Leo said to the supervisor, moderating his critique. "But policies are created to serve people, not the other way around. When we enforce rules without considering the human impact, we lose something important." He wasn't grandstanding or lecturing. His tone remained conversational, as though they were simply discussing an interesting philosophical point rather than delivering a moral lesson. Yet everyone listening felt the weight of truth in his words, made more powerful by their gentle delivery. Margaret, who had spent her life teaching children about kindness and fairness, watched Leo with a teacher's appreciation for a lesson perfectly delivered. "You know," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying easily through the hushed terminal, "I taught kindergarten for 43 years. The first thing we taught those children wasn't reading or writing or arithmetic. It was how to be kind, how to share, how to consider others." She looked around at the gathered faces. somewhere along the way, many of us forget those first, most important lessons. The supervisor, visibly moved, nodded slowly. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Wilson. And Mr. DiCaprio." She turned to Jessica. "We'll be reviewing our training on compassionate enforcement of policies." Jessica nodded, no longer the detached representative of corporate rules, but a person reconnecting with her humanity. The supervisor turned back to Margaret. "And we'll be waiving excess baggage fees for all travelers visiting new grandchildren effective immediately." A spontaneous round of applause broke out in the terminal. Not the celebrity sighting kind of excitement, but the deeper appreciation that comes when people witness authentic human connection. Several passengers were openly wiping away tears. The businessman who had purchased the meal voucher stepped forward again. "I'd like to make a donation to a teacher's fund in Ms. Wilson's name," he said, "to help other educators who've shaped generations of children." "It's not over yet. The best part is coming. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it." As boarding began for Margaret's flight, Leonardo insisted on carrying her bag to the gate. They walked side by side, the global film star and the retired kindergarten teacher, engaged in conversation as though they were old friends. Those who had been in line followed at a respectful distance, many of them transformed from impatient travelers to thoughtful witnesses. Jessica personally escorted them, her earlier enforcement of policy replaced by genuine care. "My daughter won't believe this," Margaret said with a small laugh as they reached the gate. "Not just meeting you, but everything that happened." Leo smiled, helping her get seated in her premium economy seat. "Tell her it was my privilege," he replied. "And congratulations on becoming a grandmother. There's no more important role." He handed her his card with a private number written on the back. "Let me know how your visit goes. I'd love to hear about your granddaughter." The story spread through the plane even before takeoff. Passengers who had witnessed the scene recounted it to others, each telling adding to the sense that they had observed something rare and valuable. By the time the flight was airborne, Margaret had received well wishes from nearly everyone on board. The flight attendants, having heard what happened, provided extra pillows and frequent check-ins to ensure her comfort throughout the journey. In the terminal, Leonardo boarded his own flight an hour later, declining the airline's offers of special treatment. But the impact of his actions continued to ripple outward. Videos of the encounter spread across social media platforms with unprecedented speed. DiCaprio kindness or Margaret wisdom began trending nationally within hours. The airline, sensing both a PR opportunity and a genuine moment for corporate reflection, announced a review of its customer service policies to ensure compassion remains central to our passenger experience. 3 days later, Margaret sat in her daughter's Seattle home, cradling her newborn granddaughter. Her phone constantly chimed with notifications as the story continued gaining traction. News outlets had picked up the story, contrasting the simple act of kindness with the often dehumanizing experience of modern air travel. Teachers' associations highlighted Margaret's decades of service, using the moment to advocate for greater respect and compensation for educators. Leonardo's production company received thousands of messages, many from people sharing their own stories of small kindnesses that had made profound differences in their lives. Celebrity news outlets, usually focused on scandals and relationships, found themselves analyzing the authenticity of a moment that resonated because of its genuine human connection rather than its star power. A week later, as Margaret prepared to return home, she found herself greeted at the Seattle airport by airline staff who recognized her immediately. "We've been expecting you, Miss Wilson," they said warmly, upgrading her to first class without hesitation. The staff had been among the millions who had seen the video and read the stories. For them, she was no longer just another passenger, but a symbol of the human element that their corporate training manuals could never fully capture. During her flight home, Margaret reflected on the unexpected turn her journey had taken. The gifts she'd brought for her granddaughter had been precious, but the true gift had been the lesson witnessed by thousands. That kindness cuts through indifference, that one person's action can change the atmosphere of an entire room, and that celebrity means nothing without character behind it. As the plane began its descent toward Ohio, Margaret opened her phone to find a text message waiting. It was from Leonardo, checking to see how her visit had gone, along with a photo of himself holding a sign that read, "Congratulations, Teacher Margaret." In that moment, she understood that the greatest legacy isn't fame or wealth, but the ripples of kindness that continue long after the initial act, just as she had taught her kindergartners for over 4 decades. The true measure of a person, famous or not, is found in those moments when no one is obligated to care, but someone chooses to anyway. Wow, what a story! If this moved you, imagine what else we have for you. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and let us know what you think. You'll help us grow if you'll subscribe and get notifications on. And don't stop here. Click one of the videos on your screen and keep the journey going. See you in the next one.